The 1937 John Deere Model A came up last at the Hadley Farm auction in Pratt County, Kansas, on a Saturday morning in March of 1971. It came up last because that is where auctioneers put things they don't expect to sell. It had been sitting in the south corner of the equipment lot since sunrise, half covered by a canvas tarp that someone had pulled back to reveal what lay underneath. A tractor so thoroughly consumed by rust and neglect that the green paint existed only in the memory of people who could remember when it had been there. The rear tires were flat and cracked, the rubber so old and dry that it had begun to separate from the rims in long, curling strips. The vertical exhaust stack above the hood had rusted through near the base and listed at an angle, like a fence post after a hard winter. The seat, the original pressed steel pan seat, had split along its center seam and folded inward on itself. The John Deere dealer from Kingman, a man named Frank Kellner who attended every significant equipment auction in 3 counties, had walked past it twice in the morning without stopping. He had given it the same professional evaluation he gave every piece at every auction: a single glance, a calculation, a decision, and the decision had been not worth the paperwork. Most of the crowd agreed. By 11 in the morning, the combine, the disc harrow, the grain wagon, and the 2 pickups had all sold. The Model A was what was left. The auctioneer, whose name was Bud Trask and who had been running farm auctions in Pratt County for 31 years, stepped up onto the hood of a nearby truck to get a line of sight on what remained of his crowd, maybe 40 people, coats turned up against the March wind, and gestured toward the Model A with the practiced ease of a man who had sold worse things for less money. "All right," Bud said into his portable microphone. "1937 John Deere Model A, she's been sitting a while. Needs some attention. What am I bid to start? Somebody give me 100. Give me 50. Give me something." Nobody gave him anything. $25, Bud said. "Somebody give me 25 and take this old girl home. She'll make good yard art if nothing else." There was laughter from the crowd. Frank Kellner, standing near the back, said something to the man next to him that produced more laughter from the immediate vicinity. $25, Bud said again. "Going once at nothing, going twice at nothing." 35. The voice came from the left side of the crowd, near the fence. People turned to look. Dale Pritchard was 26 years old, and he did not look like a man who was about to change his life. He looked like what he was, a young man in a work coat that had seen better years, standing alone near the fence line, his hands in his pockets, his face turned toward the tractor with the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. $35, Bud said. "Sold." The crowd lost interest immediately. Frank Kellner turned and walked toward his truck without looking back. If you've ever believed in something the world called worthless, subscribe to this channel. A new story like this one drops every week, and none of them end the way the experts expected. Let me tell you about Dale Pritchard, because the $35 did not come easily. His father, Roy Pritchard, had farmed 240 acres in Pratt County from 1948 until 1967, when a combination of 3 bad harvest years and a land payment he had extended twice too many finally brought the bank to the farm. Dale had been 22 when it happened. He'd watched his father sign the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in the county bank building in Pratt, and he'd watched the expression on Roy's face as he signed, not defeat exactly, but something older and quieter than defeat. The expression of a man who understands that the land is not going anywhere, that it will be farmed by someone, and that the fact of it not being him is a private grief with no useful audience. Roy had gotten a job at the grain elevator in Pratt. Dale had taken a second job there too, working the early shift before his work at a neighboring farm. Between the 2 jobs and the careful spending of a man who had watched his father lose everything, Dale had saved $412 by the fall of 1970. He lived in a 2-room rental on the north side of Pratt and kept his tools in the trunk of his car. He had been looking for a used tractor for 14 months. Not a new one. A new tractor was out of the question. The cheapest thing on a dealer's lot in 1971 was several times what he had saved, and a loan was not an option he was willing to consider, not after what loans had done to his father. What Dale was looking for was something old and simple and honest, something he could fix himself, in whatever space he could rent for the winter, with the tools in his trunk and the knowledge his father had passed to him across 22 years of farming. Roy Pritchard had run a 1944 John Deere Model A for 11 years before buying a newer tractor in 1959. Dale had grown up around that machine. He knew how the horizontal two-cylinder engine breathed, how the hand crank had to be set at the right position before each pull, not any position, the right one, how the carburetor needle responded to cold weather, how to read the sound of the exhaust to know whether the fuel mixture was correct. He knew these things not because he had studied them, but because his father had narrated them, constantly and unhurriedly, across every hour they had spent working together. The 1937 Model A in the corner of the Hadley farm lot was not the tractor Dale had imagined buying. It was worse than anything he'd seriously considered. But it was $35, and he understood what it was under the rust, and he had the money. He arranged to have it towed to a rented machine shed 4 miles outside of Pratt on a Monday morning. The shed cost him $12 a month. He moved his tools in that same afternoon. Now, to understand what Dale found when he took that tractor apart, you need to understand what the Model A was. The John Deere Model A had been in production since 1934. The 1937 version was a mid-series machine, not the earliest, not yet the refined post-war version, but a tractor that represented the full development of John Deere's two-cylinder philosophy. The horizontal opposed engine ran at low RPM, the two cylinders firing in sequence at a slow, authoritative cadence that produced, at full load, somewhere between 18 and 24 drawbar horsepower, depending on conditions. That number had never impressed anyone who cared about numbers. What the number didn't say was this: the horizontal engine, lying flat between the frame rails with its massive cast-iron flywheel spinning at the rear, produced its torque at the bottom of its RPM range. It did not need to spin fast to pull hard. It needed to spin at all, and once it was spinning, the flywheel stored each combustion stroke and released it in an even, continuous flow that did not spike or gap. The result was a tractor that could work in conditions where higher revving engines stalled, soft ground, heavy clay, long pulling loads, where sustained force mattered more than peak power. Beyond that, it was simple. Every component on the Model A was accessible with the basic tools in Dale's trunk. The valves could be serviced without removing the cylinder head. The carburetor could be adjusted with 2 fingers. The magneto timing could be set with a wire and a straight edge. There was no hydraulic complexity to chase, no wiring harnesses to trace, no system that a man alone in a cold shed could not understand and repair. There was the engine, the transmission, the rear axle, and the operator. That was the entire list. That winter, Dale learned the tractor the way his father had taught him to learn anything mechanical, not by reading, but by taking it apart. He pulled the engine in November. He found 2 scored valve seats, a cracked piston ring on the rear cylinder, and a main bearing that had been running dry long enough to leave a visible wear pattern on the crankshaft journal. Serious damage, but not fatal damage. He ordered parts from a supplier in Wichita. The total came to $61, which represented most of what he had left after the purchase and the first 2 months of shed rental. He spent December and January on the engine, working evenings after his shifts at the elevator. The shed had no heat except what came from a small kerosene space heater that Dale positioned near whichever component he was working on. He wore his heaviest coat inside the shed. Some nights the temperature dropped enough that the parts he was working with were too cold to hold comfortably, and he would warm them against the heater before fitting them. By February, the engine was back together. Dale ran it for the first time on a Thursday evening, cranking the flywheel by hand in the cold shed, setting the crank at the right position in the compression cycle the way his father had described. Not any position, the right one, because if the engine kicked back on an improper start, the crank came back with enough force to break a wrist, and his father had told him this once and never needed to say it again. He pulled once. The engine breathed. Twice. It found its compression. On the third pull it caught. Pop. Then again. Pop. Then it settled into itself. Pop, pop, pop. He sat on an overturned bucket and listened to it for a long time. Second winter, the winter of 1972 to 1973, Dale addressed the electrical system, the carburetor, and the running gear. By March of 1973, the Model A was running as it had been designed to run. Not perfectly, the seat pan was still split. The rear tires would need attention before another season. But the engine ran true, and the transmission shifted cleanly, and the drawbar pulled with the steady, patient authority that the design had always promised. It was in late March of 1973, 2 years after the auction, that Dale removed the battery and its tray to replace the cables, which had begun to corrode. He had been in a hurry that morning. He pulled the battery, set it aside, and reached for the tray to lift it out. The tray didn't come. He pulled again, nothing. He looked more carefully. The battery tray, a formed steel pan that sat inside the battery box and was supposed to lift out freely, had been welded in place. Not factory welded. The weld bead was rough and uneven, the work of a man with a welder and a reason, not a production line. Dale got a light and looked more carefully. Below the welded tray, the battery box was deeper than it should have been. He got his cold chisel and broke the weld bead along one edge. He pried up the tray. Beneath it, resting on the floor of the original battery box, was a tin tobacco can with a lid pressed down tight and sealed around the edge with what had once been roofing tar. The tar had hardened to the consistency of old rubber. Dale pried the lid off with a screwdriver. Inside the tin, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, 2 documents. The first was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten in pencil on lined paper, dated October 14, 1943. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had not written many long letters but understood the importance of this one. The letter was addressed to Thomas and signed, "Your father, Clarence." Dale read the letter standing in the cold shed, with the engine running beside him. Clarence Hadley had written to his son Thomas, who was serving with the 7th Infantry Division in the Pacific, to tell him several things. He wrote about the farm, about the wheat that year, about the neighbor's fence that had needed repair. He wrote about the tractor, the Model A, which he had bought new in 1937, and which had been the farm's main tractor for 6 years. He wrote that he had hidden something in the iron box on the tractor, because the bank had been asking questions he didn't like the sound of, and he wanted Thomas to know where to find it when he came home. Then he wrote, "It is the deed to the Sanderson ground, 80 acres east of Miller Creek. I paid for it in 1941 and it was never put in the bank's name. It is yours when you come home." The second document was a land deed, executed in September of 1941, 80 acres in the eastern section of Pratt County, along a creek drainage called Miller Creek. Clarence Hadley, grantor, Thomas Hadley, grantee, notarized by a lawyer in Pratt whose firm still operated on Main Street. Thomas Hadley had not come home. The farm had passed through estate proceedings after the war, but the 80 acres along Miller Creek had never appeared in any probate filing because no one had known it existed. It had sat in legal limbo for nearly 30 years, its ownership tied to a deed in a tin can in a battery box on a tractor that a crowd of people in 1971 had agreed was worth nothing. Dale folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He held the deed in both hands for a long moment. Outside, the March wind moved across the Kansas fields in the particular way it moves in that county, low and steady, and without interruption, carrying the smell of soil beginning to soften after winter. In the shed, the Model A continued its patient cadence. Pop, pop, pop. The lawyer in Pratt was a man named Gerald Morse, who had practiced in Pratt County for 40 years and had seen most of the things that Kansas land records could produce. He had not seen this. It took Gerald Morse 6 months. He traced Thomas Hadley's service record, his death in combat in February of 1945 on Leyte, his estate proceedings in 1947, and the complete absence of the Miller Creek parcel from every filing. He researched the deed's notarization, confirmed its validity, and filed a quiet title action in Pratt County District Court. In November of 1973, the court issued its ruling. The 80 acres along Miller Creek, good bottomland, creek drainage, flat and deep, were assigned to Dale Pritchard as the lawful possessor of the tractor, and the documents found within it, under a chain of title reasoning that Gerald Morse described to Dale afterward as the most unusual he had ever constructed. The land was appraised at $48,000. Dale paid Gerald Morse $800 for his work, which Gerald Morse considered the fairest fee he had ever charged. The story reached Frank Kellner at the Kingman Co-op on a Thursday in December of 1973, told to him by a seed salesman who had heard it from someone in Pratt. Frank Kellner drove out to Dale's farm the following Saturday. Dale was in the shed when Frank arrived. The Model A was running. Dale started it most mornings that winter, keeping the engine warm, keeping the seals moving, the way his father had kept things running whether they needed it or not. Frank Kellner stood in the shed doorway and looked at the tractor, at the cleaned paint where the rust had been removed, at the new exhaust stack, straight and vertical above the hood, at the running engine, popping its slow, patient count in the cold morning air. "I'll give you $15,000 for it," Frank said. Dale looked at him. "No." "20." "No." Frank Kellner looked at the tractor for another moment. What would it take? Dale thought about it. He thought about his father's face in the bank building in Pratt in 1967. He thought about the letter in the tin can, Clarence Hadley writing to his son who would not come home, hiding what he had in the iron box on the tractor because he knew the bank was coming and he wanted his boy to have something when the war was over. "It's not for sale," Dale said. Frank nodded once and drove back to Kingman. Dale Pritchard farmed the Miller Creek ground for the first time in the spring of 1974, breaking it with the Model A. He used the tractor because it was what he had, and because it was what the land had earned. By 1978, he had purchased an additional 40 acres adjacent to the east boundary. By 1984, his operation had grown to a size his father had never managed, built on a foundation of 80 acres that had been waiting in a tin can for 30 years. Roy Pritchard drove out to see the farm in the spring of 1974. Dale showed him the tractor, told him what he'd found. Roy listened without saying much. He walked around the Model A once, the way a man walks around something he recognizes. He put his hand on the engine cover. The engine was running, and Roy could feel the vibration through the cast iron, that slow, even pulse of 2 cylinders that he had felt as a younger man on a machine he had worked and eventually sold, and sometimes wished he hadn't. "Pop, pop, pop." "Your grandfather ran one of these," Roy said. "Same model. He said it was the most honest machine he ever owned." He took his hand off the engine. "Honest machines don't lie about what they are," Roy said quietly. "They just do the work until you figure out what they're worth." The 1937 John Deere Model A is still on that farm in Pratt County. It has not been sold. It has not been restored to show condition. It runs. Dale's son learned to drive it at age 9, the way Dale had learned on his father's machine, and the way Roy had learned before that. The battery box has a new tray welded in place where Dale cut the old one. Gerald Morse has the original deed in his office files framed, the only document he ever framed in 40 years of practice. The tin can and the oilcloth and Clarence Hadley's letter to his son are in a wooden box in Dale's house, on a shelf in the room that looks out toward the Miller Creek ground. In the spring, when the ground is soft and the mornings are still cold and Dale starts the Model A before first light, the sound carries out of the shed and across the yard and into the fields that Clarence Hadley paid for in 1941 and hid in a tin can on a tractor because he believed his son would come home. Thomas Hadley did not come home, but the land did not wait forever. Pop, pop, pop. 2 cylinders, slow and steady. An engine that kept a dead man's faith for 30 years in a battery box on a rusted tractor that a crowd of people agreed was worth nothing. They sold it for $35. Everything else was already inside. The 2-cylinder era at John Deere ended officially in 1960, when the company launched its new generation lineup and moved on. The engineers and the salesmen and the trade press called it progress, and they were not wrong. The new machines were more powerful, more capable, better suited for what agriculture was becoming. But somewhere in Pratt County, Kansas, there is a 1937 Model A that would like a quiet word about what gets left behind when the world decides something is finished. It doesn't roar. It pops, slowly, twice per revolution, at a pace that has not changed since 1937 and has no reason to change now because patience does not improve on itself. It simply continues, the way honest things continue, long after the loud ones have moved on.